So welcome to Unbroken, the safe place for male survivor podcast. Because every male survivor deserves hope, healing, support, and a BMW. And here's your male survivor, leadership coach, and hypnotherapist, Thomas Edward. Thomas Edward. All right, your male resiliency, all right, life coach, coming to you, of course, from Sacramento, California. I still love that song. I love the words of that song, right, by Eminem. You know, you get one shot. And it's really interesting. I had one individual, and this was kind of their one shot. And so what they did was they went up to the website and they clicked on the coaching button, and they're like, okay, I'm just going to try, one session and then just see where one session lead. I mean, the first session is always kind of discovery, session, but within that 90 minutes, people are like, wow, all this information and stuff, and the neuroscience, just depending on, where they're coming in from. And that one shot that person took, right, led them down the path. And then they're like, wow, okay, I need to do the program, right? And now their life is just totally changed, totally transformed, been able to put the family and stuff back together and getting the help that they need. And it's just like, it's been great. It's been great to see the transformation actually with them and walk through it, with them. And that's the cool thing I love about, coaching, because you get people in the place of where they are right now, right? And it's even though, you got past trauma and stuff that is affecting you, but it's like, okay, but what are the skills and tools that I need to be able to cope with it and deal with it now and actually move forward? So it's like, I think of it as touching pieces of your past, your future, but you're now here in the present. And so it's pretty cool. So that song just always reminds me of that. And it just lights up my head. Yeah, you get one shot. And so sometimes you just got to take that chance and step out there and just like, okay, I'm just going to give this a try. And the thing is, you never fail, right? To me, especially if you're working with me, I'll tell you that you never fail, because this isn't a pass fail. This is about learning. This is about growth. And so each time you experience something new, you grow, whether it's favorable or unfavorable, you grow. So you get one shot. So if you have the opportunity, make sure you use it. Speaking of that, so those of you're like, man, I've never heard of, this podcast before, or, bettermalesurvivors.com, go up to the website. And as I've been saying for the new year, we're February, but go up and click that Life by Your Design button if you think you are ready. Okay. And even if you're not, I'd say click on it. And what it's going to do, it's going to give you about, I think it's 2 months worth of just kind of, different things to think about. So each day, I think I'm going to have to hit the cough button on my ear. Well, let me drink some water. Excuse me. I can't figure out. I was like, why does this always come up when we get ready to do the podcast? Maybe I need to do some work. Maybe there's something coming up. Maybe my voice is silencing me or something like that. My body. Okay. But anyway, if you go up to the website, Life by Design, and if you click on that image there, it'll take you to pretty much a prompt, a form. And if you want to sign up, and what happens is, especially if you're just starting, the journey, it'll send you about 2 months of, I'm going to say, things to kind of work on. So you get like a little email each day, just short stuff. It might be reflection prompt. It might be a story of another survivor's story. It might be a reflection point for you to think about and answer. And they always have, you can reply. So if you're like, hey, I want to reply to this, maybe something struck it, you can actually do that. So it allows you to do that for 2 months. And then within that, you have some gathering sessions. So if you're part of the program, you already know that we do bi-weekly group coaching calls. Well, this gives you an opportunity, right, to kind of see what those calls are like, but it's just a gathering space. And so it's a gathering space where we get to come and we get to just share. Those are those that are possibly interested in doing the program, want to learn more about it, or we just get to share. And so if you've never had an opportunity to do that, that's also a wonderful place to transform in place. And then a lot of individuals, a lot of guys, once they are exposed to that, and they're like, oh, wow, you know what? This is pretty cool. I think I'm going to do the full program, because it gives them an opportunity to just experience it. I'm going to say from, kind of a safe distance. And so if that's interest of you, hey, go up to the website and then make sure you just click on that Life by Your Design. If it says January, 5th, that's when it started for this year, but it's still going. So it'll be going through pretty much September. All right, guys. So for today, we're talking about the rage and the silence. And so today you guys are going to get to meet Andrew, another survivor that I worked with years ago. And you will have the opportunity to hear, his story. But the reason I called it Rage in the Silence is because oftentimes men, we don't get taught how to actually feel anger. We get taught how to use it, right? So whatever, kicking the tires, punching holes in walls. So we use it maybe to defend. We might use it to fight. We might use it to protect. We might even use it to intimidate, or sometimes we actually use it to survive. But nobody teaches that boy how to actually understand anger, and especially when the trauma has taken place, how to express it, without destroying something. Now, I will say that depending on what you're hitting, releasing it and letting it go is sometimes a way to actually release it. But the thing is, well, how do we express it, like we said, without destroying something? How to hold it without turning it inward, and how to release it without actually hurting, yourself, himself, or someone else. And so when this boy grows up, it will say, with a childhood sexual abuse, especially when the abuse is wrapped in silence, shame, and confusion, anger sometimes becomes something else entirely. And so sometimes that anger, it becomes the voice that he wasn't allowed to use, or sometimes maybe it's the body's attempt to break out of a freeze, or maybe the anger becomes the power that he never got to have. Or sometimes for some of us, the anger becomes the signal that something in him is still fighting for life. And so I want you to even try to think of this, the anger from a different perspective. And so many male survivors, they really don't lack the anger, but they lack permission to feel it safely. Okay. And so then what happens? Well, they learn to swallow it. They learn to mute it, to shove it down, to lock it in, and to even deny that it exists until what? Until it erupts, right? So implosion, explosion is what we call it. And so explosion, shutdowns, overreactions, withdrawal, self-destruction. And so that's, I'm going to say, not rage issues. That's rage with nowhere to go issues. And so that's what we're going to hear a little bit about here with Andrew's story.
Andrew. I used to think I didn't have an anger problem. I thought I just had moments where things got overwhelming, moments where someone pushed too far, moments where I lost control for a second. But then I realized something. My moments were costing me everything. I've punched walls. I've slammed doors. I've said things I can't take back. I've scared the people I care about. I've scared myself. And afterward, I'd always say the same thing. I'm not angry, I just snapped. But here's the truth. I was angry. I'd been angry for a long time. I just didn't know where it came from. Growing up, I was the quiet kid. Didn't fight, didn't talk back, didn't make trouble. The adults loved that about me. They said I was well-behaved, respectful, mature for my age. But I wasn't mature. I was scared and silenced and confused. What happened to me as a kid, I didn't have words for it. I didn't even understand it enough to know it was abuse. I just knew it felt wrong. I knew my body went still. I knew my voice disappeared. I knew afterward I felt sick and guilty. But I didn't tell anyone. I didn't think I could. I didn't think it mattered. I thought I was supposed to pretend like nothing happened. So I did. I shoved everything down, every fear, every confusion, every memory. I became the good kid, the quiet kid, the helpful kid, the kid who never complained. But the thing about swallowing emotions is they don't dissolve. They ferment, they thicken, they turn into pressure. By the time I was an adult, I didn't feel anger. I became anger. Or at least that's what it felt like. One small thing would set me off. Someone cutting me off in traffic, someone interrupting me, someone questioning my intentions, someone challenging me. I'd go from fine to explosive in seconds. Then, afterward, I felt ashamed, confused, embarrassed, like I was failing as a man. People told me I needed to chill, control myself, stop being so dramatic, just calm down. But it wasn't that simple. I wasn't choosing anger. Anger was choosing me. It felt like my body was reacting before I even understood what was happening. My relationships suffered. My job suffered. My self-worth suffered. And the worst part? Every time I erupted, the voice in my head said, "This is why you don't deserve help." It wasn't until I started working with Thomas that I realized I wasn't broken. I was backed up, blocked, frozen, full. My anger wasn't the problem. My silence was. And the moment we started connecting the dots between the abuse and the anger, something in me finally made sense. I'm not crazy. I'm not dangerous. I'm not unpredictable. I'm hurt, and I'm trying to heal.
All right, so Andrew, like you said, he wasn't an angry man, but, he was a silenced boy, I'm going to say, living in a grown man's body. And so his explosions weren't signs of aggression. They were signs, I'm going to say, of overflow. So when a child isn't allowed to express, fear, confusion, pain, betrayal, terror, sadness, violation, whatever, it gets stored in the body, right? And that's why I said, if you haven't read the book, The Body Keeps the Score, it's a great book to read. And it's not because it wants to, but it's because it has nowhere else to go, right? And so he had nowhere else to actually put it. And so Andrew actually didn't learn to communicate, I'm going to say, anger. He just learned to actually swallow it. And so he didn't learn to set boundaries. He learned to disappear, to be invisible. That's why he was the great kids around his generation, silent, don't say anything. Oh, you're a great kid, no trouble. And so he didn't learn to express hurt, but he learned to hide it. And so when boys are abused, their anger gets trapped behind walls of shame, secrecy, self-blame, confusion, fear of consequences, fear of being misunderstood. And so the anger doesn't vanish. It waits, right? It's amazing what our body does. It's like, okay, I can't handle this right now, so we're just going to tuck it away. It's going to vanish, bam. And what is it waiting for? Usually waits for adulthood. Okay, it's like, okay, maybe we can handle this, maybe we can't, or we've stored up so much, right? And so it waits for an adulthood. It waits for the stress. It waits for the relationships. It waits for the times of responsibility. It waits for pressure. And then what happens? Kaboom, it breaks out, and usually at the worst possible moments. And so I like to say that Andrew really didn't have an anger issue. He had, I'm going to say, an unprocessed trauma load. Okay, an unprocessed trauma load. And so the load was actually overflowing. So when it comes out, the anger is what it looked like. All right, so as usual, let's go down our kind of list. Well, okay, so what was the CSA root, right? All right, so we already saw that the anger really didn't start, I'm going to say, in adulthood, but it started at the moment, I'm going to say, that the child realizes inwardly that I can't protect myself. I often get that so many times. Guys are coming in, they're trying to control this and control that. And then oftentimes when we go into, maybe we'll do a little hypnotherapy, those different type of things, it's like, oh, I just felt like I couldn't control myself or protect myself. And then it just goes to, kind of those, I'm going to say, societal ideas of the roles of men, those different type of things. And even though this is a little kid, this is a child, we kind of look at it with adult eyes and we purport, we're going to say, that level of, we're going to say, responsibility onto the child, right? And so it just becomes really, really dangerous. So what were Andrew's roots when we talk about the CSA? Well, for him, here's my voice going again. All right. Maybe I just need to hydrate more. Okay. So the roots for him, his abuser was older and in control. And so when a child is overpowered, that child pretty much learns that my body doesn't belong to me because someone else is controlling it. Someone else is taking, advantage of me, and maybe there's nothing that I can do. And so it actually creates a suppressed rage. I'm going to say the other root was that, and we've talked about this before when I shared with you the F's of trauma, or we're going to call it survival mode. So the freeze, right? The freeze, the flight, the fawn. And so when we talk about that for him, he was a froze. And so that meant that he actually froze during the abuse. So, but freeze isn't a weakness, like we said. Really, it's survival. But afterward, freeze actually feels like self-betrayal. And so men often mistake this I'm going to say involuntary paralysis for the idea that I didn't fight back, right? So, then that starts to foster, other beliefs. Oh, I must have really wanted it or thought there was nothing. No, it's just that involuntary paralysis is going on inside of the brain, but you're equating it with, I'm going to say years later, that I didn't fight back. And so then that false belief actually becomes a lifetime of anger at oneself. We're going to say another root for him is that, and he talked about it, that he stayed silent actually to avoid disrupting the family. I am so amazed, even when I think about this, as children, the complexity, the complications that our brains wrangle with to actually protect other people, right? That's why I said it's just so sophisticated. And so, he learned that his needs were secondary because he didn't want to disrupt the family. I remember, and I've shared this with you guys, before, even with I never shared with my mom what was going on because I just remember as a kid sitting and we were watching some TV show and they were talking about kids were being abused. And I just remember my mom saying, oh, if I ever found out that happened to one of my kids, I would just die. Okay, so here you are, whatever, 6, 7-year-old child, and you hear that and your brain can go in and ooh, I can't say anything because if I do, you're going to be responsible for your mother's death. I mean, it's just amazing the things that, our little brains do, right? But for him, silence then became his default, so he wouldn't actually disrupt the family. I'm going to say also, and we talk about this in code and roles within families, that for him, by being silent, part of the roots were that the parents actually praised him for his calmness, right? And so now they didn't know that it was actually shut down, but kind of during his period and time, that was seen as good. Oh, you're not this wild child or whatever, running around, misbehaving. And so quiet boys are easy to miss, right? Once again, you're invisible. I'm going to say the other thing that was part of his root was there was no emotional language that was modeled for him. And so if you don't see it modeled, you don't have the words to express it. And so for him, anger was either punished in his world or ignored. And so then what he would do is he would just, of course, store everything internally. All right, so those were what we call the CSA roots for him. So we've got the abuse going on, but then these are the roots also. Now, the reinforcing factors, which we shared a little bit about, was as Andrew grew older, I'm going to say the world rewarded the very behaviors that actually hid his trauma. So we talked about how people praised his self-control, right? So he wasn't the little kid, running around, and he was the calm kid. And so he was the kid, who wasn't showing like aggression and anger. And so people praised that because in our society, we often praise the self-control, not knowing that actually what it was suppression, right? But he didn't have any language to express that. And so he didn't express his hurt. He couldn't express his hurt. That was one of the reinforcing factors. And so when you can't express your hurt, well, no one can read our minds, right? And so then no one actually supported him. I'm going to say another supporting factor for him, or reinforcing factor, was he became reliable. So because he never said that, well, I'm not okay, then he was okay. All right, so who can we depend upon? Well, the person who's always okay. In his family, he also became the family mediator, which was another reinforcing factor, right? He's the calm one. He's the stable one. Okay, be like your brother Andrew over there, right? And so he carried other people's emotions while actually ignoring his own. Now, some of this might be sounding familiar for you, like, and things are starting to click. You're like, oh, okay. So then for him, he had a high functioning exterior, right? So no one got to see the cracks on the outside. Oh, successful, looks great. He looked fine. And so guess what? So everyone assumes that you're fine. And then I'm going to say he had no reinforcing factors. I think he had no safe role models around him, which can be very challenging to find. And so I'm going to say the men around him, I just remember when he would share some of the stories and stuff, seemed like they just kind of, they dismissed him, dismissed his emotions, or if you showed emotions, they were seen as weakness. Okay. Then I remember he would talk about, romantic interests and stuff, and that he would say that his romantic partners only saw the explosion, not the roots. And I get this because I hear this all the time, especially from spouses and significant, others. And so they reacted to the anger that they saw, not the injury beneath it. They're like, wow, where's, I don't get this, and so it was just kind of a reaction. And so every message around him reinforced that your emotions, they're just too much, right? Not that this is the unprocessed trauma. So I got to keep them inside. And inside is exactly where the anger actually becomes dangerous. All right. So those were some of the reinforcing factors. What for him, the adult impacts, well, his life looked stable until pressure hit. And then he had what's known as emotional bottlenecking. So he couldn't identify what he felt until it was too late, right? And so the anger, bam, it blows up and explodes, and it's like, but you couldn't identify it until actually it's let go. And then it's like, oh no, now you're trying to repair, relationships and reputations, those different type of things. For him and as adult, the impacts snapping, and he talked about that, right? So snapping without warning. So from him, his anger didn't really build because it was really already at that level inside. And so for him, he could jump from 0 to 100, right? No time flat, because it was really already there. I'm going to say another adult impact for him, and this is when I'm working with him, so I'm thinking of his things as an adult, total conflict avoidance, right? So for him, it was interesting because he would have conflict avoidance and then he would shoot to conflict explosion. So that's at 0 to 100, right? So he would avoid difficult conversations until they became impossible to avoid. And then when he didn't avoid them and he engaged in them, bam, all right, you're seeing red all over the place. Which then, I'm going to say moved into another adult impact. And I'm just thinking of the ways that I saw in him. So we talked about that passive side. So he was passive everywhere in most places, but then he was explosive at home. Okay. And, kind of the shark, what we call it. So at work, he would be controlled. With friends, he would be controlled. But when it came to relationships, that's where the dam would actually break. And then after that, the usual pattern, like, shame after every eruption. And so, he wasn't just angry. He was angry that he was angry. And then he was really disconnected from his body. I'm going to say until it was too late. And so he would feel the aftermath. So it's like he wouldn't understand the cues or the warning signs like, oh, this is coming, it's building up. But then he would get the aftermath. And then for him, there was this constant internal guilt. And so he would believe that he was the problem, not the trauma actually inside of him, and that his anger wasn't violence. Really, it was just grief without permission. All right, guys. So let's talk. Let's go into, of course, my favorite part. Let's talk a little bit about the neuroscience, which is so interesting. Okay, so I had a comment from a survivor who's working in some of their programs, and we were doing a coaching call the other night. And he's like, man, he's like, now that I'm just starting to see a little bit more of the neuroscience, this is making so much sense. And he's like, man, but he's like, I'm having a hard time because I'm starting to understand. But he's like, my significant other still just doesn't get it. Right. And so, but he's like, it's helping me to understand the neuroscience. And so that's one of the reasons I share the neuroscience, because it's not that you're a failure. It's just like there's some things that are going on that your body, your brain, it's just still in survival mode. And so how do we get it out of survival mode? All right. So the neuroscience takes us a little bit deeper, I'm going to say, into anger physiology. And so I'm saying the first thing we're going to say, I'm going to say the anger is a mobilization response after freeze. All right. So for those of you that haven't, I think I have a podcast where I talk about the 4 F's of trauma. If so, go back and listen to those, and then this will make more sense. But anger is a mobilization response after freeze. So when a child freezes, we're going to say during the abuse, the body stores, I'm going to say, the uncompleted fight response. Maybe that's a good way to say it, to make it understandable. And so in adulthood, the anger is the body's, we're going to say, finally trying to finish what it couldn't do back then. And now I think there's an actual name for this. Oh, yeah, it was called incomplete defensive response action. Okay. That's why I just say uncompleted fight response. It's just easier. But yeah, it's called incomplete defense response activation. And so Andrew wasn't overacting. His body was just trying to complete a survival loop from childhood. Okay. All right. When we start talking about body parts here, so what's going on? So we've got our thalamus and the amygdala. I'm calling it the thalamus amygdala shortcut. So when triggered, Andrew's brain, of course, used what's known as the fast path. Okay. So you got your sensory impulse goes to the thalamus, which then goes to the amygdala. And so remember, it's bypassing the prefrontal cortex where we're doing our logical, rational thinking. And so no logic really gets involved. And so this makes the response immediate, overwhelming, and I'm going to say it's pre-verbal, right? So you just don't have the words for it. And so that's why he couldn't think first, right? Because the prefrontal cortex is pretty much taken offline. And so his brain reacted before he thought. Okay. I'm going to say the next piece is probably, we'll say limbic. So suppressed anger actually increases limbic pressure. All right. So when we have unexpressed emotions, they don't just disappear, but it actually increases your limbic activation, right? So remember, that's kind of, we'll call it I even hate using that word primitive, but part of the brain, but sometimes that's how it's expressed. And so his body stayed in a constant, I'm going to say, lower simmer. So a lower simmer of adrenaline, a lower simmer of cortisol. Remember, that's the stress hormone, muscle tension, breath restriction. So like you're holding it in your body. And so then one small trigger pushes him past the threshold, right? Because remember, we said we're going from 0 to 100, but really all the time we're kind of at 99. No one sees it, but we're at 99. And then when that one little feather, whatever, the straw used to say that breaks the camel, it's kaboom, right? And so it wasn't bad temper. It was a chronic sympathetic overload. Okay, so his sympathetic nervous system. And then we have for some people, and I think maybe this was his case, and this is alexithymia, which sometimes we see for male survivors. So Andrew, he really couldn't identify internal, we'll say, sensations like early enough. So oftentimes, like when I'm working with individuals, we work on the technique kind of called the wrench. And the thing is, what we're trying to do, we throw the wrench in, and by throwing the wrench in, it stops whatever the pattern is. But oftentimes, people throw the wrench in too late because they can't even identify or notice maybe the sensations early enough, right, to say, oh, it's coming. And so those are one of the things that we actually work on. And so it's not because he lacked emotional intelligence, but because the trauma had disrupted his brain's, I'm going to say, interoceptive network. Okay, so just a way of saying feeling, network perception, like, oh, and you can tell, especially with those of you that have worked on things, you'll start noticing little cues and triggers and rituals like, oh, this is coming, right? That's what we mean by interoceptive network, right? So for him, the trauma had disrupted that. Okay, so he didn't know when he was getting overload. He didn't know when boundaries were crossed. He didn't know when he was hurt, or he didn't know when he needed to actually pause, right? And so he only knew when he was ready to explode, right? So that's 0 to 100. And then I'm going to say the other part when we talk about neuroscience for him, I call it the shame plus anger neural loop. And so pretty much after many of his outbursts, shame would trigger, and you guys remember we talked about the dorsal vagus system, just kind of a shutdown. But then what that would do, that would just actually lead to more suppression, which then increased, of course, the next explosion. So then you just had this whole loop going on. Anger, shame, suppression, pressure, bam, then anger. Okay. And so it wasn't personality flaw. It was he was caught in the loop. All right. So now we start talking a little bit about strategy after I get a water here. All right. So strategy. All right. So now sometimes people will come in and people are working with them and they'll say, okay, we just need to give you some anger management classes. I'm going to say for Andrew, he didn't really need anger management. He needed, I'm going to say, anger understanding. Managing anger is like managing steam while ignoring the boiling pot underneath it. And so our strategy when we started working and coaching this focused on releasing the pressure before the explosion. Remember, we talked about the wrench and noticing the signs. So rewiring how his body interprets the, I'm going to say, activation, and then teaching him how to actually feel the emotions in real time, not after the damage is done. And so I'm going to share with you just some of the approaches that we use. Remember, everyone is not the same, and that's the cool thing about coaching is that you have to work with the individual because it's not cookie cutter, right? And so you have to sit there and figure out these things. Okay, how's this going to best work for this individual? And then we work with it, and it's like, okay, that works a little bit, but having issues here. Okay, then we tweak it, right? And so that's why I love it, because you're an individual, right? You're unique, you're special. And then our coaching, that's how we work with you. All right. So I'm going to say for the approach, the first thing we did was we taught him, or the strategy was to identify the micro signs before the anger would actually hit 100%. So that's 0 to 100. So it's like, hey, let's see if we can help you to learn the micro signs before the anger actually hits that level. So Andrew, he didn't know that he was getting angry until he was already, we're going to say, in the anger mode. And so we built a personal kind of like early warning system. And what we did was we actually used physical cues. And so we use things like body scan. Now, those of you who've done body scans, you totally get this, right? So the physical cues, tightening jaw. Okay, do you notice that each time what do you feel? Oh, my jaw's tightened. Okay, that's when you do the body scan, that's when he understands. The tongue is pressing against the roof of his mouth. He would notice now that his fingers would start curling inward. He would notice actual physical heat, like rising up in his chest and face area. He would notice now that his vision was narrowing, his breath was shortening, his shoulders were rising, and that his stomach were clenching. And so what he would notice now when doing the work was that these were the first signs, not his explosion, but these were the first signs. So these were the micro signs. And so that was one of the strategies. And so when he started doing that, what it did, and noticing that, it started to actually create space between the trigger and the actual reaction. Okay. The next strategy, I remember when I was working with him, is we had him to step out. Okay. So this was kind of the don't power through it rule. Okay. So step out, don't power through it rule. So when Andrew actually felt now these early activations that he had practiced, the idea was now to, okay, whatever I need to leave for 90 seconds, right? No explanation, no arguments. Okay. Now, this was not to avoid conflict, but this was actually to prevent overload. Remember, we talked about that. And so from a physiological perspective, that 90 seconds was enough for the amygdala surge to actually cool down. And I think I shared this with you guys. I shared about my experience when I was working at Microsoft. The whole oatmeal incident where so much had just piled up, and then the explosion that I had. But you got to give yourself time, we're going to say, for the amygdala surge to cool down. Now, 90 seconds is what we got to when we learned to when we learned the micro signs, those different type of things. Before that, it actually wasn't that fast. Okay. So he wasn't escaping. What he was doing was he was just interrupting the old pattern with that 90 seconds. And that was one of the things we were shooting for. Then the next thing we learned or we used as a strategy was to just simply name the sensation. So not the story. And so Andrew's mind would jump straight to like, hey, they disrespected me, or they don't appreciate me, or I'm losing control. Okay, that's where his mind would just jump to. And so we retrained that mind to actually pause the narrative and say, actually do a body scan. My chest is tight. My jaw is locked. My pulse is rising. My stomach is tense. Now notice what that, even if you're just listening, notice what happens. So going from just jumping to the narrative, oh, they disrespected to me. Wait, my chest is tight. My jaw is locked. So I'm noticing the micro signs that are there. Well, why? Because the body calms faster when you actually describe sensations instead of defending your story. Okay, did you guys hear that? Your body calms faster when you describe the sensations instead of trying to defend whatever your story. And so this shifts the activity, guess from where? From the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex. I remember because I do leadership classes, right? And so I always throw the neuroscience in. We talk about, conflict management resolution, and I go through the neuroscience and talk about, the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala and, what that looks like and when it's bypassing when you're in that moment. Well, that's the reason, the strategy for him, instead of jumping to the narrative, we'd had him to notice to name the micro signs, the sensation. Then the other strategy, and if you work with me, you guys know we always do breath release work. So with him, we did the 3 breaths, right? So the activation hit. So inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 2, and then exhale for 6, right? And then on the exhale, make sure that you drop the shoulders, right? So the long exhale, what it does from a neuroscience perspective, so it signals your vagus nerve that everything is safe. That's what the long exhale is for. And so he would practice this daily, not just when he was angry. Here's the point when you're working on things. If you want consistency, you have to practice it. And what you're doing is you're practicing it so that when the event happens, your brain and your body has other options because you practice it. And so it's like, oh, I don't have to go down this road. I can actually go down this road. And so it gives us options. And so that repetition actually helped him to build a baseline of what calm was. One of the other strategies was converting anger into boundary clarity. And so Andrew believed that anger was failure, right? And so what did we do? Well, we reframed it. So anger is actually information. It always is. Right. And always when I'm working and we're talking about conflict and like, oh, how do we define conflict? And no one can really define what conflict is. Right. And I remember when I was studying in martial arts in China at the Shaolin Temple, and we talked about conflict, and they're like, all conflict does, it just shows you where the barriers are. It's information. Right. Well, anger is the same thing. It's information. It tells you when something is off. It tells you when a boundary actually is needed. So instead of suppressing anger, he learned to actually follow its message. Oh, what was the message? Oh, well, whatever needed wasn't met, or what boundary was crossed, right? So you start asking yourself these questions, or what expectation was violated, or what emotion is actually underneath this. And so anger softened once he actually started to understand it. And then the final, there's more, but the last one I'm going to share with you. I mean, when you're working with somebody for, like 18 months, there's so many things that you go through. And the last thing I'm going to share, though, is that we practice leaving without shame. And so many survivors, we might explode because we don't feel that we have permission to walk away before things get bad, right? And so with him, what we practiced was, hey, the idea of like, I'm getting activated, I need to step away and now return. Okay, so he's giving yourself actually permission. And just that one sentence for him actually saved, I'm going to say, multiple relationships. All right. So coaching and resiliency, right? And so this was kind of still with the strategy, but when Andrew first, I'm going to say, started out working with me, he came in convinced that he was broken. Okay. Not even traumatized, but just broken. And so that's what I'm going to say unresolved anger does to a man. It convinces him that he's defective, that he's dangerous, that he's actually unpredictable. But what I saw, it wasn't a dangerous man. I saw a man who had never been taught what to do with the fire inside of him, right? How to use that fire. And so the first thing we worked on wasn't control, it was permission. And so he needed permission to feel. He needed permission to express. He needed permission to leave the room, to slow down, to name the sensations, not to be the calm one, which was the role that was given to him, and not to hold everyone else's emotional weight and not to swallow everything whole. So men like Andrew, and maybe that's you that's listening, so they've lived their whole lives being the steady one. And I'm going to tell you that role sometimes becomes a prison. And so our first breakthrough happened during an exercise. And I asked him, I said, hey, so where does anger live in your body? And when he heard that, he kind of froze. And he tried to answer from his mind. Okay, so from the prefrontal cortex, which is most men, we do. That's what we do, right? And so we try to get logical, rational. But then I stopped him. I said, no. Not the story. Where in your body? And I remember this because his eyes started watering. And so he put his hand on his sternum and he said, right there, right? It's been here, he said, since I was a kid. And so I remember telling him, hey, you know what? I would tell him something that no one has ever told you before. And I said, that's not anger. I'm like, that's grief disguised as anger. And I remember when I said that to him, that kind of shattered him, because suddenly he started to understand that he wasn't dangerous. He wasn't failing. He wasn't defective, and he wasn't unpredictable. He was hurting, and his hurt had never been allowed, one, to be expressed. It had never been allowed out. So then what we did was we practiced what I call the release ladder. Okay, so we practice it. And I use this with a lot of guys who are dealing with deep freeze anger loops. And so for him, the release ladder, if you've never done it, is identify the first body cue. Okay. The second thing is you stop talking immediately once you identify it. Okay. You step out. So this is 90 seconds for a minimum. You step out for 90 seconds. You actually move your body. So whether it's you shake, stomp, pace, whatever, it doesn't matter. You're actually moving the body. So this is the somatic part of it. Then you do that exhale that we talked about. Exhale longer than you actually inhale. Remember what that does to your system. You name the sensation without adding the story. Okay, so we talked about that. And then you return only when your regulation is back online, right? So what was the biggest win for him? Well, he used it during an argument actually with his partner. And so instead of exploding or shutting down, he said, hey, and this is the thing, you got to have these tools because people just think, hey, what are you doing? Why are you walking away from me? And then that just might escalate you. So he says, hey, I'm getting activated, so I'm just going to step away, but I'm going to come back, whatever, within 10 or 15 minutes. Right. So then that sets the expectations for the person. It's not like I'm just stepping on you. I'm getting activated. Right. So we have to create the language for him and his partner to use. And so then that way she didn't feel abandoned. She felt safe for the first time actually in their conflict cycle. And so did he. Right. And so then came that moment that changed him, even changed his fatherhood. And I remember he told me, he says, you know what? My son got frustrated, and instead of yelling, he put his hands on his chest, he breathed, and he learned from watching me. That's generational trauma breaking right there in the middle of an ordinary living room. So Andrew wasn't just healing anger. He was healing the silence underneath it. But then he was modeling for the next generation, right? What to do, how to handle it. And it's just, for me, it's very emotional when I heard those words, because that's what he was doing, and that's what we're doing. He was breaking generational trauma. And oftentimes we don't, because we just ignore these things. And we think, oh, I was abused. Oh, I'm okay. And we don't know these things that we're passing on to our kids, to the children. All right, get off my soapbox here. So Andrew wasn't, we say, dealing with the anger. He was healing the silence that was actually underneath it. So he began, talking more. He began feeling more. He would leave when he needed to, and he would return when he had regulated. And so expressing instead of exploding, releasing instead of storing, and naming instead of suppressing. Woo. Oh my goodness. Okay. This is, yeah. It's interesting. I noticed the podcast where I do the stories on the different guys, the ones that I've worked longer with are the ones who have longer stories. Cause man, there's so much. Yeah. All right. So let's close this up. So our reflection and our recap. So if you're listening to this and any of Andrew's story sounds familiar to you, okay. So first of all, realize that anger is not your enemy. Silence is. And so your body remembers every moment that you weren't allowed to speak up, every moment that you were overpowered, every moment that you swallowed pain to survive. And so guess what? Anger is that trapped energy demanding release. You guys know I always use this analogy when we talking about energy, right? Energy wants to move in the outward direction. But oftentimes the problem is our issues are we're holding it in, we're trapping it, we're not allowing it to actually be released, and that becomes destructive. And so for him, we were teaching him this anger that was trapped inside, demanding to release, that what we're going to do is we're going to do what's known as an honest release, not a destructive release, but an honest one. So ask yourself, if any of this applies to you, where does anger actually live in your body? Is my anger really anger, or is it the grief in disguise? There are so many things that are in disguise. When do I feel pressure building? Or what are my earliest physical signs? Or do I allow myself to leave before I actually explode? Or who taught me that I'm not allowed to feel, right? Remember we talked about those BS rules that sometimes we get from society and parents, even also other ones. And what am I afraid will happen if I express, right? That, hey, you know what? You're not too much. You're not dangerous, and you're not out of control. And so maybe you're just a man who's carrying more than he was ever meant to carry or hold alone. And so your anger is not a flaw. It's actually a message. All right, guys, that is our wrap for today. Hey, I hope that Andrew's story actually maybe helped to bring you, maybe not total peace, but maybe a little understanding. Like I said, so many guys, when I started explaining the neuroscience and those different type of things, they're like, wow, this is just making so much more sense for me. And that's where they start using words like hope, right? And remember, hope is a combination of desire plus expectation. And so they start having an expectation they're not going to be like this forever, right? That change is actually coming, and they're going to be able to make that change. All right, guys, that's the wrap for this podcast session. Hey, remember, I'm always here. Remember, you can always go up to the website, bettermalesurvivors.com. Send me an email, right? Take that first step. And as I always say, do something.